I remember the way the evening light poured through my office window, painting the walls in muted gold, as if even the sun was too tired to shine fully. It was past 7. The last of my students had shuffled out an hour ago, leaving behind that familiar silence that follows exam season. Piles of anatomy test papers sat scattered across my desk, the inked diagrams of skeletal structures and nervous systems still staring up at me like patient ghosts. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, exhaustion heavy in my bones. Being a professor at the medical university was demanding enough, but exam days always carried an extra weight. Evaluating the precision of every answer, checking for that spark of understanding in the way students mapped out the complexity of the human body, it was a strange, obsessive kind of satisfaction. The door creaked open, soft but unexpected. I looked up, prepared to tell whoever it was that office hours were long over, but my words caught in my throat when I saw him standing there. My son, Daniel? My voice rose in surprise. What are you doing here? It's late. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room in a way that instantly shifted the air. My son, 21 now, tall, composed in that way young men are when they've just begun to understand their own strength. But his eyes held something unusual tonight, a quiet determination mixed with something I couldn't yet name. I waited downstairs, he said, closing the door behind him, his voice calm but edged with something, hesitation maybe. The secretary told me you were finishing up late, so I thought I'd wait. I pushed my chair back, surprised but not displeased. I hadn't seen him for over a week. You could have called first. I'd have. I need to ask you something, he interrupted, and there was a pause. He stepped closer, slow, almost deliberate. Something important. That caught me off guard. I gestured for him to sit, but he stayed standing, his hands shoved into his pockets like he was trying to hold something back. What is it? I asked, my curiosity piqued, though I tried to sound casual. He took a breath, and for a moment his gaze flickered to the anatomical charts on my walls, the muscular system, the reproductive organs, all meticulously labeled as they always had been. I need you to teach me, he said finally, his words precise, as if he'd rehearsed them. Teach me about female anatomy. I blinked at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. Female anatomy? Daniel, you've had biology in school, you? No, he said, shaking his head, stepping closer now. Not like that. I mean properly. The way you teach your students. Thoroughly. The room seemed to grow smaller. His words were innocent enough, clinical even, but the way he said them, quiet, firm, with his gaze fixed entirely on me, felt anything but casual. Why? I asked, leaning back slightly, trying to keep my tone even. He hesitated, shifting his weight. Because I want to understand. Really understand. Not just what's in textbooks. You're the best person to teach me, Mom. You know all of this better than anyone. The silence that followed was heavy. I should have laughed, dismissed it, told him to look it up himself. But I didn't. Something in his voice, earnest, almost pleading, held me there. And something inside me shifted, just slightly, in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. It was absurd, I told myself. He was my son. I was his mother, a professional, someone who spent her life teaching future doctors to treat the human body with respect and precision. But as I looked at him standing there, waiting, that strange heat crawled through my chest unbidden. Daniel, I said finally, forcing my voice steady. You do realize how unusual this request is. I know, he admitted, his jaw tightening. But I trust you. And I need this. Please. The way he said please was quiet, almost too quiet. I looked at him for a long time, the sound of my own heartbeat suddenly louder in my ears. And then, before I could stop myself, I nodded. Fine, I said, my voice softer than I intended. But we'll keep it academic. Do you understand me? A slow smile tugged at his lips. Not smug, not teasing, but something that made my stomach tighten in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. Of course, he said. But even as I said yes, I knew something had already changed. The clock on my office wall ticked louder than usual, Or maybe it only felt that way because of the silence stretching between us. Daniel sat now, finally taking the chair opposite my desk, but his posture was too straight, too alert, as if he were preparing for something far more serious than an anatomy lesson. I busied myself with clearing the remaining exam papers, stacking them neatly just to give my hands something to do. My mind was spinning, trying to remind itself of professionalism, of boundaries, of the fact that this was just a lesson. Yet, no student had ever looked at me the way my own son was looking at me now, steady, focused, as though every word I said would matter more than any lecture I had ever given. "All right," I said finally, letting out a slow breath. "If we're going to do this, we'll do it properly." He nodded, the corners of his lips lifting slightly in that way that always reminded me of when he was a boy, back when he used to look at me with the same unwavering trust. But now he was no longer that boy, and that trust carried something heavier. I moved to the anatomy models on the side of the room, the same ones I used for students. My hand hovered over the life-sized female torso model, its removable layers exposing the musculature, organs, and finally, the reproductive system. "Start with the basics," I told myself more than him, forcing my voice into that calm, lecturer's tone I had perfected over the years. I began, pulling off the outer plastic layer to reveal the underlying muscles, is the superficial muscular structure of the female torso. Pay attention to how the pectoral muscles overlay the mammary glands, which are not muscles themselves but specialized. "I know that part," he interrupted softly, his eyes fixed on me, not the model. I stopped, blinking at him. "Then what do you want to focus on exactly?" He hesitated for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk before he said, "Everything you'd teach a medical student. But explain it in detail. The kind of details you give in advanced classes." I frowned slightly, narrowing my eyes at him. "You're unusually interested for someone who's not pursuing medicine." His gaze didn't waver. "I want to understand. Completely." There was a weight to the way he said it, something that made my chest tighten. I turned back to the model, focusing on the physical details, trying to keep my tone clinical. "The mammary glands consist of lobules, ducts, and adipose tissue," I explained, removing the breastplate to show the inner structure. "They're highly vascularized, which is why." "Show me," he interrupted again, his voice quieter this time. I glanced at him sharply. "Daniel, this isn't." "Not like that," he said quickly, shaking his head as if realizing how it sounded. "I mean, could you explain by showing the placement? Like you would with a real patient during an examination?" I froze for a second, my hands tightening slightly on the model. It wasn't unusual for me to use myself as an example when teaching, gesturing to my own arm when discussing veins, or my ribs when describing intercostal muscles. But this, I swallowed, trying to keep my voice level. "You mean demonstration?" "Yes." His answer was immediate. Too immediate. For a long moment, I didn't move. The rational part of me screamed that this was still just an academic request, that there was nothing wrong with explaining anatomy by touch and placement. But something in his eyes, the way he was watching me, made me hesitate. I drew in a slow breath and placed the model back on the table. "All right," I said finally, keeping my tone firm, professional. "But only because you need to understand the placement in relation to the skeletal structure. Nothing more." He nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, satisfaction maybe. I stood, smoothing my lab coat unconsciously, before gesturing to my own torso. "The pectoral muscles run here," I said, tracing a line across my chest, "and the mammary glands overlay them in this region. The ducts converge toward the nipple, which is located at approximately the fourth intercostal space." Daniel's eyes followed every movement, his expression unreadable, but I could feel his attention like a physical weight. "And the lymphatic drainage follows the axillary nodes." My voice faltered slightly when I caught his gaze again. It wasn't curiosity in his eyes. It was something deeper, something unspoken. I looked away, forcing myself to continue. "The pelvic anatomy, of course, is far more complex. We can discuss that next if you're serious about learning." "I am," he said, his voice low, steady. Something about the way he said it sent a quiet shiver down my spine. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of how warm the room felt. Then we'll continue another day. It's late, and you should head home. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but he simply stood, giving me a small, almost knowing smile. Tomorrow then, he asked. I hesitated before answering. Tomorrow. At home. It will be easier there. His smile deepened, just slightly, and for a moment, I regretted agreeing. Because something told me that tomorrow, everything would feel different. The next evening, I caught myself straightening the living room for the third time, though Daniel had seen this house 1,000 times before. There was no reason to fuss over the position of the pillows on the couch or whether the books on the coffee table were stacked neatly, yet my hands kept moving, restless. I told myself it was just a habit, a professor's tendency to keep things orderly, but deep down I knew it was something else entirely. The doorbell rang at exactly 7, sharp and punctual, as if this were some official appointment. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, casual, yet somehow deliberate. He had always been handsome, of course. He was my son, and I had seen him grow from a curious child to the young man before me. But tonight, for the first time, I truly noticed how much he had changed. His shoulders seemed broader, his posture more assured, and there was something in the way he looked at me, a calm steadiness that was unnerving. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He walked in, his gaze briefly sweeping the room as if taking it all in. "Still looks the same," he said with a faint smile. "It hasn't changed in years," I replied, closing the door behind him. "Why would it?" He didn't answer, just set his bag down on the coffee table, and for the first time, I noticed that he had actually brought a notebook and pen like a real student attending a private lesson. That small gesture sent a strange ripple of pride through me, mixed, however, with something else I didn't want to name. "All right," I said, forcing a breath. "We'll start with what we didn't finish yesterday, the pelvic anatomy. Sit." We settled across from each other at the table, the soft hum of the evening filling the quiet space between us. The only light came from the floor lamp in the corner, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. I opened one of my own medical textbooks, flipping to the relevant section. "The female pelvis," I began, my tone slipping into that practiced academic rhythm, "is structurally different from the male pelvis, wider, with a larger subpubic angle to accommodate childbirth. The pelvic inlet is—" "Can you show me?" he interrupted, just as he had yesterday, his voice calm but carrying that quiet insistence. I hesitated. "Show you what?" "The way you would teach a real student. Placement. Orientation. Like you did yesterday." My jaw tightened slightly, but I nodded. "Fine." I stood, motioning for him to do the same. "The iliac crest runs here," I explained, letting my hands hover over my own hips, "and the pubic symphysis is located here, at the anterior midline. The pelvic floor muscles form a sling beneath." "Wait," he said softly. "Could you guide me? So I can feel the placement myself? You said yesterday that tactile learning helps retention." He wasn't wrong. I said that exact thing to my students all the time. And yet, hearing him say it now made my chest tighten. "Fine," I said after a pause, my voice clipped, as if strictness could disguise the way my pulse had started to quicken. I stepped closer to him, taking his hand. His skin was warm against mine, far too warm, and I carefully positioned it against the outline of my hip bone. "This," I said, keeping my tone as clinical as possible, "is the iliac crest. It runs along this ridge." I moved his hand slightly, tracing the bone structure. He nodded, his gaze fixed entirely on me, not his own hand. "And here," I continued, lowering his hand slightly toward the anterior superior iliac spine, "is the landmark for the inguinal ligament. It attaches." I stopped mid-sentence when I felt his fingers twitch, just slightly, against my skin. Not accidental, at least, it didn't feel that way. I looked up sharply, but his face was calm, almost too calm, as if he were concentrating solely on the lesson. Go on, he said quietly, his voice steady, almost gentle. I swallowed hard, pulling my hand back from his. That's enough for today. But we haven't finished. I said that's enough. I interrupted, stepping back. My heart was beating too fast, and I hated how aware I had become of every small movement between us. He didn't argue. He just gave me that same quiet look, his expression unreadable, before sitting back down. All right, he said simply, closing his notebook. But as he packed his things, I caught him glancing at me, just for a second, with a look I couldn't interpret, part curiosity, part something else entirely. When he finally stood to leave, he said, "Tomorrow, then?" I opened my mouth to refuse, to tell him this had gone far enough. But instead, I heard myself say, "Yes, tomorrow." As the door closed behind him, I stood in the middle of the quiet room, my pulse still racing, knowing I had just crossed an invisible line. The following evening, I told myself 100 times that I should cancel. I paced the hallway, my phone in hand, thumb hovering over his number. All it would take was one message. "We'll stop this, Daniel." It's inappropriate. But each time I considered typing the words, I hesitated, as if something inside me refused to let go. And then, exactly at 7, just like before, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, he was standing there again, casual as ever, that same faint smile on his lips. It wasn't arrogance, no. Daniel had never been arrogant, but there was a quiet confidence about him that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. "Hi, Mom," he said simply, stepping inside. I forced a smile. "You're punctual as always." "Wouldn't want to miss a lesson," he replied, setting his bag down. This time, I didn't lead him to the living room. I don't even know why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe foolishness, maybe something darker I didn't want to name. But instead, I gestured toward the hallway. "We'll work in my room tonight," I said, my voice calm, though my heart had started to beat harder in my chest. Daniel didn't question it. He simply followed me. My bedroom was neat, as it always was, though I suddenly became conscious of how personal it felt to have him here. The soft cream-colored sheets, the faint scent of my perfume lingering in the air. This wasn't a sterile lecture hall, or even the neutral space of the living room. This was mine. "Sit," I said, motioning to the chair near my dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to keep some distance between us, though the room already felt too small, the air too warm. "Tonight," I began, opening my textbook, "we'll discuss the reproductive system in detail. The ovaries, fallopian tubes, and... Can you show me again? Like yesterday." His voice was quiet, but insistent. I hesitated. "Daniel, this isn't the same as showing you bone landmarks or muscle structure. This is more delicate." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on mine. "I want to understand it properly. You said yesterday that tactile learning helps. So teach me properly." I should have said no. I should have stopped this right then. But his words, spoken so steadily, so calmly, echoed in my head like a challenge. "Fine," I said finally, though my voice was softer than I intended. "But keep your mind on the lesson. Nothing else." He nodded, standing slowly, waiting for me to guide him. I drew in a slow breath, standing as well. "All right," I said, trying to keep my tone clinical. "The pelvic region begins here." I took his hand again, placing it gently on my hip, just as I had yesterday. His fingers were warm, firm, and I had to remind myself to keep my breathing steady. "The ovaries are located deeper, just medial to the iliac vessels," I continued, moving his hand slightly inward. "They're almond-shaped structures attached to the uterus by the ovarian ligaments." His gaze didn't leave my face, not once. "And the uterus itself," I went on, my voice quieter now, "sits between the bladder and the rectum, normally tilted forward, anteverted, over the bladder." I moved his hand just a little higher, guiding it as I would with any medical student learning examination techniques. But the difference was undeniable. This wasn't a classroom. This wasn't some anonymous student. This was Daniel. For a moment, silence stretched between us. His fingers rested exactly where I placed them, not moving, but the weight of his touch felt heavier than it should have. "Like this?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Yes," I said, my throat tightening. Should I trace the landmarks myself? To memorize them? My heart skipped. He was asking for permission, and I knew what my answer should be. But instead, I heard myself say, yes. Slowly. He obeyed, his fingers moving carefully, almost hesitantly, along the path I had shown him. His touch was clinical at first, deliberate and precise, but the longer he moved, the more aware I became of every small contact, every brush of his skin against mine. "Good," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's enough." But he didn't step back right away. He paused, his hand still resting lightly against me, his eyes meeting mine in that same unflinching way. "Tomorrow?" he asked softly. I opened my mouth, torn between refusal and something else entirely. But once again, I betrayed myself. "Tomorrow," I said. And when he finally left, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door long after it had closed, my heart still pounding, my thoughts spinning wildly. Because tomorrow, I knew, there would be no going back. The next evening, I found myself dressing with more care than usual, though I told myself it was only because I'd come straight from work and didn't want to look disheveled. I changed out of my usual professor's blouse into something softer. A pale, loose sweater and comfortable pants, something casual, harmless. At least, that's what I told myself. The clock had barely struck 7 when the doorbell rang again. Just like before. Just like every evening this week. When I opened the door, Daniel was already looking at me with that same quiet steadiness, his hands in his pockets, his hair slightly tousled from the breeze outside. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice calm warm. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside. My tone was neutral, but my pulse betrayed me, quickening the moment he passed by. Tonight, I didn't lead him straight to my bedroom. Instead, I gestured toward the kitchen. "We'll start with something to drink," I said, almost too quickly, as if casual conversation could somehow slow the growing tension between us. He followed without question, sitting at the small kitchen table while I busied myself with making tea. The clinking of porcelain cups filled the silence, but it didn't feel like silence. It felt heavy, charged, as if every unspoken thought lingered between us. "Long day?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. "Very," I said, placing his cup in front of him. "Exams are exhausting." "You look tired," he said softly, watching me. "You should rest more." I gave a faint laugh, sitting across from him. "I'm a professor, Daniel. Rest isn't part of the job description." His gaze lingered on me, longer than it should have. "You still look beautiful, though." The words were quiet, almost tentative, but they landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. I froze for half a second, then forced a small smile. Flattery won't make me a better teacher. He didn't smile back. He just looked at me, his expression calm but unreadable, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't joking. The silence stretched, and I stood abruptly, clearing my throat. "We should get started." This time, I led him to my room again. The door clicked softly shut behind us, sealing us in a world where the rules of professor and student, mother and son, felt increasingly fragile. He sat in the chair near my dresser, just like before, but tonight his posture was different, more relaxed, as if he knew I wouldn't send him away. "Where do we continue?" he asked. "The internal structures," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You need to understand the position of the uterus, the adnexa, and the pelvic floor." I stood in front of him, holding the textbook, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were on me. "Stand up," I said finally, deciding to move through the lesson quickly, clinically. He obeyed, stepping closer. "All right," I began, taking his hand again. My fingers trembled slightly, but I kept my tone professional. "The uterus lies between the bladder and rectum, normally anteverted. The ovaries are lateral, connected by the broad ligament here." I moved his hand slowly, carefully, over the outline of my lower abdomen, keeping my voice steady, my expression calm. But Daniel didn't pull away this time. His fingers lingered, his touch light but deliberate, and I could feel the warmth of his skin even through the thin fabric of my sweater. "Like this?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "Yes," I said quickly, stepping back slightly. "That's correct." But he didn't step back. "Mom," he said suddenly, his tone softer now, almost hesitant. "Can I keep going? Memorize the rest by myself? You said yesterday that practice helps retention." My heart skipped, my breath caught. This was the moment where I should have stopped, should have ended it entirely. But instead, I heard myself say, "Yes." Slowly. His fingers moved again, tracing the same paths I had shown him, careful and precise, yet every movement felt too aware, too intentional. His gaze never left mine, and for the first time, I couldn't find the strength to look away. The room felt smaller, the air warmer, every second stretching longer than it should. When he finally stopped, his hand resting lightly against me, he said, "Tomorrow?" I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed to end this now, to pull back before the line disappeared completely. But once again, I betrayed myself. "Tomorrow," I whispered. And when he finally left, I sat on the edge of my bed again, my heart racing, my thoughts tangled, knowing with terrifying certainty that tomorrow would change everything. I don't know why I prepared the room that evening as if I were expecting someone other than my own son. The sheets were perfectly smooth, the curtains half drawn to soften the evening light, and I'd lit the small lamp on my nightstand, casting the room in a warm, amber glow. When the clock struck 7, right on time, the knock came. My heart gave a sharp, traitorous thump. I opened the door, and there he was again, Daniel. His presence seemed to fill the doorway, casual in his jeans and dark shirt, yet somehow carrying an energy that felt anything but casual. "Evening," he said simply, stepping inside. "Evening," I replied, closing the door behind him. Neither of us spoke as we walked to my bedroom, though the silence felt anything but empty. When he entered, his gaze swept briefly over the room, over the half-dimmed lamp, the neat sheets, the open textbook resting on the dresser. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, but he said nothing, only taking his usual place near the dresser. I stood by the bed, smoothing the edge of my sweater, as if that could steady me. "Tonight," I began, forcing my voice into that same academic rhythm I had clung to all week, "we'll finish the pelvic floor anatomy. You need to understand how the levator ani supports the pelvic organs, and—" "Show me," he said quietly, interrupting me the way he always did. My heart gave another traitorous leap. I nodded, moving closer.
"Fine.
"But we keep it professional. Understand?" He nodded, though the way his eyes held mine made me wonder if either of us still believed that word meant anything anymore. "Stand," I instructed, and he obeyed, stepping closer to me. The air between us felt charged, too warm, too heavy. I took his hand, guiding it once again to my hip. "This is the iliac crest," I said, my voice steady despite the faint tremor I felt inside. I moved his hand lower, along the path I had shown him yesterday. "The pelvic floor muscles are positioned here, forming a sling to support." "Can I do it myself?" he asked, his voice softer now. I froze for a moment. Then slowly I nodded.
"Yes."
Slowly. His hand moved carefully, tracing the landmarks I had described, his touch deliberate, precise. But this time he didn't rush through it. His fingers lingered, following the paths I'd guided him along before, as if memorizing not just the anatomy, but me. I forced myself to keep speaking, to maintain the pretense of teaching. "The levator ani originates at the pubic bone," and my words faltered when his fingers brushed lightly against my lower abdomen, softer than they needed to. He looked up at me then, his eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I didn't look away. The silence between us stretched, deeper and heavier than any lesson we'd had before. My breath quickened, though I tried to steady it. "Is this correct?" he asked quietly, his fingers still resting where I'd guided them. I swallowed, nodding slightly.
"Yes."
That's correct. But neither of us moved. His hand stayed where it was, his gaze never leaving mine, and something inside me shifted, snapped, maybe. This wasn't a classroom. This wasn't a lesson anymore. Daniel, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mom, he said softly, almost a question. And then he stepped closer. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every thought screaming in my head. His hand left my hip slowly, deliberately, only to move higher, resting just lightly against my arm, his touch warm, almost tentative, as if asking for permission without words. I didn't stop him. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine now, his breath warm against my skin. Tomorrow, he whispered, as if giving me an out. But instead of answering, I felt my hand move, traitorously, foolishly, resting lightly against his chest. And that was when it happened. His lips touched mine, soft at first, hesitant, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I kissed him back. Just for a second, one stolen, impossible second, the line we had been clinging to all week vanished completely. When we finally pulled away, breathless and silent, neither of us spoke. But we both knew there was no turning back now.